Morning mist settles softly across a quiet stretch of river in what is now western Germany. The water moves slowly between grassy banks, reflecting pale light from an overcast sky. At first glance, the landscape feels ordinary: fields, trees, and a river that bends gently through the countryside. But beneath this calm surface lies a question shaped by both water and time. How could a carefully engineered harbor, built along a restless river nearly 2,000 years ago, disappear so completely that its docks and riverfront structures now rest buried beneath layers of sediment and water? This is the ancient harbor zone of Haltern, positioned along the Lippe River. Today, the river moves quietly across the northern plains of Germany, threading through wide floodplains where soil remains soft and fertile. The landscape feels open and level, with forests appearing in patches along the water's edge. Yet rivers like the Lippe are never truly still. They drift slowly across their floodplains, carving new channels while abandoning old ones. Over decades and centuries, the current rearranges sandbanks, reshapes shorelines, and deposits layers of sediment wherever the water slows. Long ago, this shifting river became the center of a remarkable experiment in engineering. Along its banks at Haltern, the natural shoreline was transformed into a structured harbor. Wooden frameworks were driven deep into the riverbed to anchor piers against the current. Rows of heavy timber posts supported platforms extending into the water. Behind them, reinforced embankments created stable ground above the floodplain. The design allowed boats to approach safely, even as the river rose and fell through seasonal cycles. From the water, vessels would have seen an organized shoreline, docks projecting outward, landing areas prepared for cargo, and pathways linking the river's edge to activity on land. In a landscape where rivers constantly reshape their banks, this harbor represented an attempt to bring order to movement. Yet the Lippe River never stopped shifting. And over time, the same river that once made this harbor possible would begin to hide it, quietly covering its structures beneath layers of soil and water. The harbor did not collapse dramatically. Instead, it slowly slipped beneath the changing riverbank, leaving its wooden framework sealed beneath the floodplain. The Lippe River moves with a patience that is easy to overlook. Its waters rarely surge with sudden force. Instead, they drift across the floodplain, adjusting their path little by little. Each season brings small changes: currents that carve slightly deeper channels, floods that spread thin layers of sediment across the surrounding ground. Over time, these quiet movements reshape the entire landscape. When the harbor at Haltern was first established, the river flowed directly beside a carefully prepared stretch of shoreline. Boats traveling along the Lippe could approach the bank with relative ease. The waterway served as a natural corridor across the low plains, linking distant regions through a navigable route. To make use of that route, the river's edge was transformed. Timber pilings were driven deep into the soft riverbed, forming rows that anchored the harbor's structure. Heavy wooden beams connected these posts, creating stable platforms above the water. From these platforms, piers extended outward, allowing boats to dock even when water levels shifted. Behind the piers, the shoreline itself was reinforced. Earth was packed against retaining walls built from thick timber frames. These barriers held the riverbank in place, preventing currents from eroding the working areas above. Walkways and landing terraces likely stretched along the edge of the water, linking docking points with storage zones and open ground farther inland. In this way, the harbor became more than a simple landing place. It was a carefully engineered interface between land and river. The design allowed vessels to arrive, unload, and depart with efficiency. Cargo could move directly from boats onto stable ground. The river's natural unpredictability was managed through structure: posts, beams, and embankments guiding the flow of water around the harbor works. For a time, the system worked. The piers held steady against the current. Boats could approach the docks. The shoreline remained firm where the floodplain might otherwise have softened into mud. But the Lippe River never truly stands still. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, its channels began to wander. Where water once flowed deep beside the harbor, sediment slowly began to gather, and the first quiet signs of change began to appear along the riverbank. At first, the changes along the Lippe River would have been subtle: a sandbar forming slightly farther downstream, a shallow stretch where deeper water once flowed. Small deposits of silt settling along the edges of the harbor works. In a river that shifts constantly across its floodplain, such changes might not have seemed unusual. But over time, those quiet adjustments began to reshape the shoreline. The river's main current slowly drifted away from the harbor. What had once been the deepest part of the channel began to fill with sediment carried by seasonal floods. Fine layers of sand and silt settled between the timber pilings. The water near the docks became shallower, softer under the surface. Gradually, the riverbank moved. A pier that once extended into open water might suddenly reach only a muddy edge. Landing areas that once received boats easily became difficult to approach. The harbor still stood, but the water that gave it purpose was slowly withdrawing. Maintenance could slow the process, but not stop it entirely. Sediment would have needed to be cleared away. Timber supports repaired after floods. The reinforced embankments strengthened where currents pushed hardest against the shore. For a time, the harbor likely adapted to these pressures, but rivers operate on longer timelines than any structure built beside them. As the Lippe continued to shift across the floodplain, the former channel beside Haltern gradually lost its flow. Water moved into new paths across the low landscape. The harbor's edge, once shaped by currents, became part of a quiet backwater. Then the river began to cover what it had abandoned. Floodwaters carried new sediment across the old shoreline. Layer by layer, soil accumulated around the wooden frameworks of the piers. The posts that once stood above the waterline sank into damp earth. Platforms collapsed as their foundations disappeared beneath silt. Yet something remarkable happened during this burial. Because the soil remained wet and oxygen poor, the timber did not decay quickly. Instead, it stayed sealed within the saturated ground. The same sediment that buried the harbor also protected it. Over centuries, the floodplain continued its slow transformation. The harbor faded from sight, but beneath the quiet fields along the Lippe River, its structure remained preserved in darkness. Centuries passed, and the Lippe River continued its quiet work across the floodplain. Channels shifted again and again, wandering across the soft ground. New banks formed, while old ones disappeared beneath layers of sediment. The harbor that once stood at the river's edge gradually became part of the inland landscape. Above ground, nothing revealed what lay beneath. Grass spread across the former shoreline. Trees rooted themselves in soil that had once been the edge of a working harbor. The river flowed nearby, but its course had moved away from the structures that once depended on its water. To anyone standing on the surface, the land appeared undisturbed. Yet just below the ground, the harbor remained. Rows of timber posts still marked the edges of ancient piers, preserved in the waterlogged soil. Wooden beams lay where they had once supported platforms above the river. Reinforced embankments revealed how the shoreline had been shaped to hold back currents and stabilize the floodplain. What survived beneath the sediment was not scattered debris, but the outline of a planned harbor system. The river had buried the infrastructure, but it had not erased it. Waterlogged soil created conditions that protected the timber for centuries. Without exposure to air, decay slowed dramatically. The structures that once guided boats along the Lippe remained sealed within the floodplain, preserved by the very environment that had concealed them. And so the original question returns: how could a carefully engineered harbor disappear so completely? The answer lies in the quiet power of rivers. Unlike stone walls or mountain ridges, riverbanks rarely stay fixed in place. Channels drift across floodplains, carrying sediment that reshapes the land. What once stood at the edge of deep water can over time become dry ground far from the current. When the Lippe changed course, the harbor no longer stood beside the river that gave it purpose. Gradually, the floodplain reclaimed the shoreline. Sediment buried the docks. Soil covered the embankments. The harbor slipped beneath the surface without collapse or destruction. Today, the river still flows across the same landscape, calm and steady. Fields stretch along its banks, and the water moves quietly through the plains of northern Europe. But beneath that peaceful ground, the harbor at Haltern remains. Its wooden frameworks lie sealed in the earth, a silent record of how people once shaped a shifting river, and how the river slowly shaped the land again in return. The harbor has not vanished entirely. It simply waits beneath the floodplain, preserved where the river left it behind. If this quiet journey along the buried harbor of Haltern sparked your curiosity, you may enjoy exploring more ancient places where landscapes and time reshape the works left behind.